in the philosophy department here at the University of Guelph, and the co-academic director of GeoAI. And so Graham Taylor, our other co-director, is on the call as well. So thank you all for coming out to our seminar series talk. And so for the introduction of today's speaker, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Nost, who's an assistant professor in the geography department and was sort of one of the reasons that we invited Professor Sieber today was on Eric's recommendation. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you for the introduction.
Thanks, Gus. I also want to acknowledge some of my colleagues who also, such as Dr. Jen Silver, who also nominated Dr. Renée Sieber for our talk today. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Sieber. She is Associate Professor of Geography at McGill University. Spanning over 20 years, Dr. Sieber's research program is in Geographic Information Science, or GIS, and then the design and use of information technologies more generally. Briefly, her work treats technologies as more than just tools. She's perhaps rare kind of GI scientist who is equally comfortable talking about tessellation and data ontology as Ornstein's ladder of participation. Whether it's how we aggregate data from smart city sensors or how we represent indigenous hydrology, Dr. Sieber's work is characterized by a dedicated engagement with practical mapping issues, but also steadfast refusal to separate these from questions of ethics, democracy, and social empowerment. To my mind, this is really crucial if we're serious about ensuring that our data tools improve life. We need to be able to understand whether and how conservation organizations will use them, or whether and how they would facilitate participation in municipal government decision-making, to share just two topical examples from Dr. Sieber's work. Indeed, our work is defined in advanced public participation in GIS by considering what makes so-called volunteer geographic information meaningful participation, what the rise of open government data portals entails for civic engagement, and currently what public involvement in geographic AI or GeoAI might look like. Dr. Sieber's research papers have garnered a lot of citations, thousands of citations, and I encourage you to read her work if you haven't already. But I also want to share a couple of things you maybe won't find on Google Scholar, including her work as a co-convener of AI and Municipal Government Community of Practice, which is an informal group of practitioners and researchers, sharing lessons, developing community, making collaborations around AI projects in city government, as well as a co-author of a recently published white paper for the American Association of Geographers on locational information in the public interest. In short, Dr. Sieber is pushing the boundaries of geographic practice as we contemplate and perhaps engage AI, while also making it clear what geography has to offer to computer science. And for her work, she was named American Association of Geographer Fellow in 2019, and has also earned the Lifetime Achievement Award and the GIS Science Excellence Award from the Canadian Association of Geographers. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Sieber.
Thanks. And I would like to borrow that for my promotion to full professor, because I am truly honored to be with you. And that was an unbelievably nice way of introduction. So thank you so much for that. So just to reiterate a couple of points, I have done GeoAI, location-based AI. It's mostly natural language processing and classificatory systems. I've also done some work on explainable AI or XAI, and a little bit of image detection as well. My work is going increasingly into GeoAI ethics and public participation in AI, but also to add to the AI and Canadian Municipalities Community of Practice, which is an awesome group of people. It's primarily data scientists working in city governments across Canada, and I'd encourage any of you who'd like to come by. Our next meeting, third week of February of this month, is going to be the City of Toronto talking about their data and AI initiative. It's just been a really amazing journey. We're in our third year now of talking about the challenges and the opportunities of the practice of AI by non-computer scientists. So none of these people are Yoshio Bengio. They're all struggling, and a lot of them have learned, by the seat of their pants, how to deploy AI, mostly machine learning, but some deep learning as well. So I also want to add that I'm currently the public engagement lead for the IEEE working group on AI procurement and government. That is another interesting challenge in and of itself, to work with a lot of engineers who think this stuff is just a tool. And why should we be that worried about ethics? Or if we are, it's a pretty standard way of involving the public just to get their feedback. And we need to no more than that, because AI is good, right? It's invariably good. And it's only bad actors that might turn it for bad, but it's neutral and objective. So with that, why, and if you want to ask me questions later about location-based AI, or if you want to ask me questions about AI ethics, which are not in this talk, feel free as well. So why involve the public? This is according to the World Economic Forum. The involvement of civil society in the governance of AI has been identified as crucial by a wide range of state and non-state actors. Civil society can help ensure AI benefits us all. It can help steer AI in a positive direction. Just want to note here that one of the challenges in talking about public participation is front-loaded. Do you call them the public? Do you call them citizens? Do you call them civil society? Do you call them stakeholders? Do you call them humans, for humans in the loop? So it can be quite challenging, even though we posit that involving the public is crucial. What we call these people can complicate how they participate and how we include them. So involving the public is also considered to be a form of smart engagement. Often when we talk about the public, we talk about them at very high jurisdictional levels, like involved in national decisions, but they're also involved in municipal decisions. So Jung et al. Talk about smart engagement to represent a kind of direct democracy and participatory planning that would define a vibrant society with citizens engaged as active participants in the inclusive planning process, with the ability to connect humans through physical, digital, online, and hybrid engagement. Yes, that's good, but there are many, many challenges in the way of that. One challenge is there anything new here? One of the things that you learn when you study public participation is it's a very durable challenge. What makes effective participation? What makes meaningful participation? It often devolves to a numbers game or an identity game. Do you have enough people? Do you have enough of the right kind of people? It is also processual in that most people focus on the process of public participation and not on the outcome. So is the facilitation good enough? Do you have a sufficient number of workshops, or should they be focus groups? So there's very little focus on the outcome sometimes. Now add AI or any kind of technology into the mix. I'm best known for my work in public participation GIS, which doesn't necessarily solve the challenges of public participation either. But just because you throw artificial intelligence into it, and I'll get to ways in which you throw AI into it, doesn't mean that you solve it. Doesn't mean that using NLP to passively harvest content or using AI and chatbots to guide it doesn't solve it. AI, in fact, could make it worse through, we all know by now, the challenges to our world of pervasive and ubiquitous surveillance. By the way, that is geo-based, so geographers have a huge role to play in looking at the questions of surveillance, of the surveillance state, with Ring doorbell cameras, for example, offering the last kilometer of surveillance, so connecting the public to the private. Classificatory systems like unsupervised or supervised classification. And I have an example here of labeling protesters in predictive modeling as domestic terrorists, which was done with vegans in the US protesting a Hormel chili plant, in which predictive analytics were used to label them as domestic terrorists as opposed to people engaged in civil action. And there's also the challenge, possibly that makes public participation worse, is that it's very opaque. It's opaque in how it works. It's opaque in the steep learning curve. And as I've written in the Transactions and GIS paper, it's also opaque in that it's used to promulgate the myth of automation, that you just throw data in a bucket, you don't need to pre-process it, you don't need to do any feature engineering, and magic comes out. Insight comes out of it, enlightenment comes out of it. And we often undervalue the human interventions to make the AI, the deep learning, or the machine learning work. And what we've seen recently around ChatGPT-3 and the use of very low-paid Kenyan workers exposed to very brutal imagery, so and brutal texts, so that they can label toxic content to protect Western or global North eyes. That is an example in which humans have to be very much involved in the process of ensuring that the AI works magically as it is promised to work. We often have a very poorly designed governance and participatory processes that can be exacerbated or at least furthered by AI. So what you're seeing here is a report from a set of policies in Germany to try to engage the public in talking about what AI should look like and how AI should be regulated, or at minimum soft laws like norms should be promoted to rein in AI or to ensure that AI is for good. This deep dive done by Jones into this process found that the durable challenges were there. Civil society's notorious lack of funding and their notorious lack of time. And often when people were brought in from civil society, it was on a who knows who basis. So it was often the same people over and over again who were invited. And it wasn't as expansive or as broad as we would like public participation to be. And when they were brought in, the civil society members were grouped together in a single working group on the societal impacts of AI, and other working groups, such as the ones on health and care or production and industry, did not involve independent civil society actors. And I hate to tell you that this plays out identically in Canada. In my experience working with the Treasury Board and with other agencies, don't want to throw any shade on people who are working to the best of their abilities, but it's the same old people. And then very much, there was a really interesting article in written by Sarah Elwood in a GIS journal, in International Journal of GIS, that talked about how in Intro to GIS articles, ethics was relegated to week 10. So you have a single class on AI ethics, you encapsulate it, and you think that you've solved your public participation, or if you had adequate public participation, and indeed you do not, because of the pervasive nature of AI that permeates pretty much everything we do these days. You can't just say, you know, we got you there in this room, goodbye and good luck, we heard you. I don't want to throw, well, okay, this is going to be some amount of throwing shade. I am somewhat critical of AI for good. It is not a substitute for participation, mostly because it's a bunch of computer scientists, not throwing shade at Mila or anything here in Montreal, but it's often done by a group of computer scientists who say, we know what's important. We know what you want us to work on. You want us to work on climate change. You want us to work on poverty. You want us to work on sex trafficking. We've got the technology. We've got the data. We can do that. It is not done with the public. And unfortunately, AI for good often is done as a way to assuage guilt. It's like, oh, I may be irresponsible, but if I do a bit of AI for good, then I can feel more comfortable about what I'm doing. AI for good often implies soft law, not hard law. Don't regulate us. Instead, we're going to fund private sector X, company X says, I'm going to put money into AI for good initiatives. Therefore, there's a norm I'm establishing that we're going to do some amount of responsible AI. We're going to do our algorithmic impact assessment, our AIA. We don't need to be regulated. AI for good, ironically, is not good enough of a term anymore. And now we've got terms like friendly AI, which is mostly about the user interface. So as long as we improve the UI UX, then we will make more AI for good. And unfortunately, it often can make us feel better as we're increasingly surveilled and commodified. Oops. One of the interesting things about AI and public participation, and this is from Tarleton Gillespie, is that we often think of there's the public, and the public is quite static. But it is indeed not. If you go way, way back to John Dewey will say the public actually doesn't exist until you have a problem where they address the problem and then they form around that problem. Gillespie says that AI is actually creating shifting publics, or what he calls calculated publics, in which the technology is reshaping the publics, the users, and then the users in turn reshape their practices to suit the algorithms they depend on. And we've certainly seen that with, not with AI necessarily, but with machine learning and recommendation engines from YouTube, where YouTube content creators may introduce more radical content because they can game the system. So they know that the recommendation engine is going to gear more content to them because they're more radical, say right-wing, and they in turn become increasingly right-wing to further feed the algorithm. So it can shift our understanding of who the public is and can constrain or normalize certain kinds of perceptions of the public on the basis of what the algorithms do to them and with them. So let me get into a little bit of details about what public participation in AI typically looks like now. It typically looks like polls in terms of how do you feel about AI? Are you concerned about ChatGPT? Are you concerned about predictive policing or facial recognition technology? It can look like stakeholder engagement. It can look like public feedback. So we're going to run a survey, or we're going to open up a public comment period for people to react to. For example, I've been on a couple of responses to the Toronto Police Services AI policy that it's proposed. So they open up a window of time. You provide feedback to that. You may have mini publics of various kinds, permanent citizen assemblies or citizen juries. Often there are initiatives to do participatory design. And people will talk also about co-production and co-creation. Let us get the public involved in AI. So because this is a part of, at least for municipalities, this idea that we want the public to collaborate in decisions about space in the city. So we will allow them to co-create visions of space. With the exception of participatory design, most of these are after the fact. So they're done after the AI is implemented and then the public reacts, as opposed to getting involved early on in the design stage. So participatory design is about the only one that is at least tries to get in early in the development process. What about those stakeholders? I always pull a special mention for stakeholders, because this is often a go-to for public participation. I don't know what these public are. They're like everybody. They don't have formed opinions about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a bunch of people who I decide has a stake in the process. So it's going to be predictive policing, facial recognition technology. So I'm going to find a certain number of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color to get involved. There are recognized nonprofits. So I'm going to pluck a couple of people from them. So as you can see in the way I'm framing this, I'm very skeptical about the role of stakeholders, because once again, someone else is deciding who has a stake and who does not. And obviously, reaching back to the calculated publics, who has a stake might be shifting over time, and not all stakeholders are the same. Often when you create stakeholder engagement, you flatten the resources of everyone. So you basically say, hey, someone from a poor grassroots group, you come in, you meet in a room, and another stakeholder is going to be from an industry association. So who has the time, who has the resources to participate? It's very unequal. And unfortunately, stakeholder engagement has been a go-to in Canada for a very long time, with, I think, very mixed results, because among other things, it's still processual. It's still focused on getting the process right and not having tying what was said in meetings to actual outcomes and influence. Co-production sounds good, right? The challenge, as Mona Sloan and others have mentioned, is co-production and co-design sounds good, and it can be a part of a collaborative and deliberative environment, but it can be too easily conflated with participation as work. So as opposed to participation as, say, social justice, it is you supply us with data and we will work with that data. You also see human in the loop. Human in the loop is a very common term in machine learning to effective. I mean, as ostensibly it was about decision maker oversight over the design and deployment of algorithms. It has increasingly become like figure 8 mechanical Turk crowdsourcing, where the human is the person who's doing the labeling for the annotated training data sets. But there is a very fine line between human in the loop annotation and this oversight. And indeed, we've seen morphings of human in the loop to concepts like community in the loop and society in the loop. And I would argue that even if you rebranded as society in the loop, you're still not shedding the crowdsourcing baggage that human in the loop has. Non-civil society actors may not only be developing AI for good, but also determining algorithmic justice. Non-civil society actors are very active in developing algorithmic impact assessments, in developing the Canada Directive on automated decision-making, on developing the surveys for responsible AI. But one has to ask the question, who's writing those regulations? Who's writing those survey questions? I've been involved so far in 2 algorithmic impact assessments, and it has been very interesting to see how much these AIAs are, for example, individuated. So it becomes a matter of personal privacy. And that is what we have to protect, not larger structural issues of algorithmic justice. So who writes the regs? It's a good chance that it is AI firms. And I'm applauding what's happening at Guelph, because all too often AIAs are developed by professional associations who then must have to depend upon their subscribers, big tech and other firms, to fund them basically to continue to do their work. So are you going to write restrictive questions that really interrogate AI development practices? Or are you going to sort of soften them and say, okay, do a better job next time? There's a lot of people stepping in to ask questions about, well, what about computers handling some of the problems? Since a lot of deep learning relies on data, I should give a nod to reinforcement learning, because not all deep learning needs a lot of data, but most of the systems that we're working with are classificatory, which means that they need training data sets. So we have plenty of examples of biased data, whether that's data for predictive policing with Clearview AI, or the famous case of Amazon's HR system, in which they wanted to triage people to increase, because they get a lot of resumes coming in, and they said, well, gosh, we seem to be hiring the same white guys and Asian guys over and over again. Let's try to broaden this out to women and other minorities. And they said, okay, so let's feed that model. Let's train that model with past successful resumes. So what did they get? They got more of the same. So they didn't at all meet their objectives. So they then said, let's debias the data. And because what they were finding were resumes that referenced women, like women's basketball or an all-women's college, were being rejected because the successful resumes didn't have any of that. So they computationally debiased the data, or differentially debiased the data, and they ran into the same problem because the semantics in the natural language processing was picking up the different ways that women are acculturated to write resumes from men. So women were still being discriminated against, even though the data went through a cleaning process, a debiasing process. So debiasing is far, far, far from an effective solution to addressing some of the problems. And I mentioned GPT-3, the precursor to ChatGPT, and the amount of work that had to be done to debias that, and there was still bias showing up. I don't know how many of you who have seen the Infinite Seinfeld that was done recently, in which the AI was used to generate kind of an 8-bit version of Seinfeld that was on that ran infinitely. I thought it would get stopped because of a DMCA strike, but no, it gets stopped because Larry Seinfeld told a transphobic joke and got struck from Twitch. So you can try as much as you want with keywords and such to debias the data, but computational debiasing is far from the solution, and it still often redounds to human annotation to attempt to get rid of that. As I alluded to before, AI has intruded into everyday life, including participation. Chatbots can be used to steer public participation. Natural language processing through passive harvesting can be used to infer participation. So you have this massive public feedback session, you get millions of words of comments. Oh my God, we don't have enough public policy people to go through and read all of that. Why don't we use NLP? Why don't we use unsupervised classification to infer what the public wants? So AI also has a role in actually guiding the participation when we think, no, public participation is actually a human-to-human activity. Well, increasingly it may not be. What are participation's end goals? Often participation end goals are optimization of the algorithm. Help us make a better algorithm. Help us make sure it performs faster and is customized to what you actually want. I mentioned reCAPTCHA here, even though it's been kind of depreciated. Most everyone has been exposed to reCAPTCHA in terms of look at these 9 squares. Where's the stop sign in these 9 squares? That actually was building a training data set for algorithms. It may be used to improve the user interface and the user experience. That's far from the goal of what we who do research in public participation with regards to technology think should be the end goal of participation. Participation's end goal might be trust with XAI and literacy. Let me drag trustworthy AI a bit in XAI, explainable AI, even though I have a paper coming out in Transactions in GIS on the challenges of integrating XAI and GeoAI, is that this often means, first of all, social acceptance of AI. We don't necessarily want to use public participation to merely get people to accede to AI, but to interrogate the AI. Likewise, XAI and literacy, they're very tricky because XAI, despite what Arietta said in his well-used definition of what XAI is, it begins with given an audience. So often when we think of trustworthy AI in combination with explainability, we forget the given an audience part of it. And when you look at most XAI, it often makes the AI more opaque. Feel free to argue with me at the end. But absent the use of visualizations with XAI, XAI reduces to gradients and other algorithmic approaches that convince computer scientists that the AI is performing as expected, but it is very far from being able to explain to people how the hidden layers work. And obviously, Finland had a huge countrywide session to try to up the literacy of the public about AI. And it was pretty successful, and it might be interesting to apply that to Canada. But literacy is not an end goal. Literacy needs to be a means to an end. And we still then have to ask the question, what is the end? Do we want more social acceptance of AI? Do we want more ability to interrogate the value of AI? We need to be asking those kinds of questions. Participation's end goals might be, assuming that people want democracy as opposed to, say, a technocracy, or unfortunately, polls about AI, depending upon the country you're in, might be something like, we welcome our AI overlords. Democracy is messy. Participation in participatory democracy is even messier. Wouldn't it be easier if we had some objective and neutral tool that governed us? Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who would appreciate that. So assuming that people want a participatory democracy, participation's end goals might be deliberation and design, development and deployment, rather than, say, checking off a box and having only token participation. What a lot of us working in public participation, the end goal is political power, influence, and justice. To that end, I give you an example of common pluralistic approaches to power, in which contests over interests are assumed to be visible. This is visible power, which in turn are presumed to be relatively open. And unfortunately, rarely do the powerful give up their power easily. This often involves conflict and power struggles. Okay, fine. Therefore, we have public participation to include more of the public. However, there is also invisible power, which is something that we don't always explicitly acknowledge. In other words, the facilitators, the agencies construct the pie, what is acceptable discourse, what are acceptable outcomes rather than questioning whether it's the right pie at all. By influencing how individuals think about their place in the world, this level of power shapes people's beliefs, sense of self, and acceptance of the status quo, even as their own superiority or inferiority. And I think in an increasingly automated world, and the way in which algorithms can construct what is considered acceptable, or your place in society, or your ability to rise in society, we have to allow spaces where people not only engage as stakeholders, but they question whether it's the right pie they're engaging in. So Eric mentioned Arnstein's ladder of public participation. So I'm going to, in the last bit of time, talk to you about a model I'm working on of public participation with AI that goes from the basement of AI participation to more of a social justice approach to public participation. For those of you who do not know, this is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. It is the most widely referenced model of citizen participation in the world. There have been many derivations of it with the International Association of Public Participation or in participatory planning, but it retains salience. So even though she did it around housing issues in the United States, it has been applied to many, many different fields. So you can see in her ladder of ascending participation and goals towards social justice that it actually starts with a number of types of participation that are effectively non-participation, including manipulation and therapy. Just to pick out therapy as an example, you go to so government X holds a series of public consultation meetings, and they hear people rant about blank. We've had certainly some notorious ones in Quebec about accommodation of religious symbols. And you hear people rant about things, and then you say, bye, thank you for your input, and you leave, and that is the end. So the idea is that you're supposed to be making people good because they've had their piece, but you actually do nothing with that information. To tokenism, which might be, we're going to tell you what the technology is about. We're going to tell you what the policy is about. This is a very common technocratic approach, which the underlying assumption of technocracies are the reason that the public wants to be involved at all is because you haven't adequately explained something to them. So use this opportunity to better explain in language they might understand what is going on. Up through consultation and placation, and only near the top, you see where citizens have some degree of influence in the outcomes of participation. So they're given some amount of power during a participatory process. For those of you who know something about new public management, delegated power is an instance of that. So, welcome to my challenge in trying to determine what a model of public participation in AI might look like. So, I'm going to go through a couple of sections in just a moment, but just to give you this sense that that there are a couple of extra rungs here, that this is a hierarchy, that you ascend the hierarchy, and not all citizens, not all publics will want to reach that higher level. Some of them may be satisfied with lower levels. Some of them might enter at the middle and rise up. So it's not that everyone is going to want to be at the very top, because as you can imagine, at the very top, it is quite resource intensive. So for example, this is where a lot of our public participation in AI is right now, where you are, for example, getting a polling firm to conduct surveys to assess support for AI in government or trust in AI. It might be in responsible AI, where experts work to make AI fair, transparent, accountable, explainable, and ethical. They may debias the data, audit the data through first and second party audits, but not through third party audits, or develop AIAs, algorithmic impact assessments. The point here is that it's done for the public and not by the public. So the experts, it will be the experts often who will be assuming how people are harmed and who have a stake. And up to consultation, where citizens may serve on AI ethics stakeholder boards or citizen juries to identify AI harm or bias in data. The expansion I have to my ladder is that AI can actually be not a form of token participation, not a form of non-participation, but a form of anti-participation, where AI is used to disrupt engagement or intimidate citizens in terms of surveillance, censorship, disinformation, customization of propaganda, cyber attacks, etc. And Kalyani talked about the use of bots to create the illusion of public support or to sow distrust in a democratic project. So we have to be mindful that we may be using AI to guide participation through chatbots or through NLP, but AI unfortunately might be used to destroy participation or to provide an illusion of participation where none exists. Oops. And I rise to the top where I talk about greater citizen control, public control of the discourse and the practice of AI, where individuals and groups might be involved in collaborating with government to co-develop regulatory regimes in which AI is deployed. You saw that in New York City when they first proposed to regulate AI, or at minimum to expose the internals of AI. There's a lot of talk about AI auditing. You might know about O'Neill's, God, no, I can't remember the name of her company now. I think it's Orca. She wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, and she subsequently created a firm that does third-party or second-party audits where you essentially say, your company, and you say, here's my model, here's my data, go in, essentially do, GANs or adversarially try to break my model, or at minimum try to train it with different data to see if the outcomes are the same or different. And that can occur in these partnerships. It can be capacity building. So it's civil society-led initiatives to build skills around AI development and automated decision-making through, for example, the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit or the People's Guide to AI, to provide technical support to get engaged in working with the data as a nonprofit organization, and up to counter AI, where citizens apply the technology themselves to disrupt the status quo and confront existing technology by learning it or outsourcing the expertise to meet their specific needs. You're going to think probably that is impossible. How could citizen groups do that? But I've got to tell you, with OpenAI's, the people who gave you ChatGPT and ChatGPT 1, 2, and 3, before that, they have software libraries now. You can use those software libraries. R, for example, has Python have software libraries for machine learning. So you can do your own random forest, you can do your own decision trees, you can do, you've been able to do Bayesian statistics for a long time. These tools are far more accessible, or they're increasingly accessible over time to work with. So the applications can include developing, modifying, or reverse engineering, for example, through visualizations of XAI. They can certainly draft legislation, or they could game or spoof the app. Of course, and I have a couple of examples of that in my bibliography. Just want to say that there is always a danger here where you want to opt out of these things, but you could be mischief makers or trolls. So, and essentially, my ladder could become a circle where citizen control becomes a form of anti-participation. But I'm pretty optimistic that citizen control is a way to achieve a meaningful public participation in AI. And here are, I don't know if any of you want to take screen caps of this. Here are numerous examples I've found so far of ways to at least have more citizen control and citizen collaboration, including examples in which gig workers were gaming the Uber algorithms. I don't think I have the one where UK students were protesting and they effectively turned back the UK government's use of algorithms to try to determine whether they would get, A levels or get into the university of their choices. But there are a number of examples. The very top one is a New York Times article in which an activist turned facial recognition against the police. He built a tool that could identify police officers who had taken off their badges. Obviously, not very popular with the police, but his argument is that if the police can do it in crowds to identify people protesting as a part of the what's recognized as essential and legal in our society, then why can't we turn it on the police? And with that, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your questions, regardless of where they come from.